Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast, where it's all about turning your job search into a slam dunk. Your host is Angela Copeland.
Welcome to the Copeland Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Angela Copeland. On the phone with me today, I have Dr. Tanya Menon in Columbus, Ohio. Tanya is a professor at Ohio State University, and she gave a TED Talk called The Secret to Great Opportunities, the Person You Haven't Met Yet. Tanya, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Angela, for having me on.
Well, I was so impressed when I first reached out to you. You were so receptive, and the first thing you said was, give me a call. And I think it's such a good example of, why we should maybe not be scared and reach out to strangers, because sometimes it works.
Yeah, and I also checked you out before I said that, by the way.
Oh, okay. Well, I think that probably speaks to how important our online brand is, especially like when we're job searching. Because if you don't have a great brand, you may not get a response, I think.
Absolutely.
Well, in your TED Talk, you actually mentioned that we have a tendency to want to spend time with people who are the most like us. And I observe this myself. And I think in particular, this can happen when we're looking for a job. I think those are sometimes the people that we go to and expect, to help us as we're looking for a job, like the people who are the most familiar. I'm curious from your perspective, why do you feel like that strategy of going after those people that are just like us, why does it fail us when we're looking for a job?
Yeah, I think it's such a natural tendency, and I think it's also an important strategy that we have in life as well, finding people who are similar to us. In fact, when we look at starting jobs, for instance, one of the things that I tell people, and it's often really good advice, when you start a job, make sure there's at least one other person who's like you there, right? You want some similarity. You want to have at least somebody who's going to be there to think like you, to support you. And if you have that kind of a person, that person can help you really integrate into that situation. Otherwise, it's really isolating. So we don't want to be alone and with in a world where we're unique and all by ourselves in a very isolating manner. What we also don't want is to be in a world where everyone is exactly like us. And so it's really the sweet spot we need to find with having a comfort zone of like-minded people, and then also being able to wander from that comfort zone. And wandering from that comfort zone, it's really, really important, as you said, when we're looking for new opportunities, because the same old opportunities, they're not coming from the people that we know. We know what they know. Researchers in networks have called this like a zone of redundancy, where you're interacting with people who are exactly like you and who know what you know. When we step outside the common, familiar core networks that we have, that's where we discover information that's new, that's different, and these opportunities that you're referring to.
Yeah, I think you're right. And you bring up a really good point about, when you look for a job, maybe finding some place to work where there is someone else who's like you. And I don't mean using that person necessarily to find a job, but I have actually a number of times been the only digital marketing person on the team where I worked in a company that was maybe somewhat old-fashioned. And it would have been helpful to have, more peers. So I can also see that side. But it's interesting that you mentioned redundancy, because it sounds like what you're saying is that maybe the people who we expect to add the most value, like our brother or our best friend, they don't have some special secret that they haven't told us yet.
Yeah, and so the point is, being alone, being a token, whether it's being the only woman in your group or the only person of a particular nationality in your group, that's really hard for people. Or as you're saying, the only person who's trained in that particular way. Those are really hard places for people to be because you don't have support. And so support is something we get from our clicks. What you're referring to in terms of this redundancy and expanding outside the social network is sometimes we don't need support. Sometimes we need new information. And network researchers such as Mark Granovetter, they came up with this really remarkable idea, which they call the strength of weak ties. And so what the strength of weak ties is referring to, it's exactly what you're saying. If you think about your brother, if you think about people who are your really, really good friends from high school or from your community, those tight-knit core networks, those are unlikely to be the types of people you are getting a job from. And so what Mark Granovetter said is, he said, it's not those strong ties that are going to give you your jobs, it's those weak ties. And it's not their weakness that is causing you to get those jobs. It's the fact that your weak ties actually are offering you something different because they're not so similar to you. They have different knowledge, different information. They're traveling in probably somewhat different social circles than those core networks where you know the same information as those very, very close knit ties. Those weaker ties are what can give you a ticket to a new social world. And that's their power. The power is not their weakness, but their diversity, according to Mark Granovetter.
I like that. I love how you say the ticket to the new social world. I think you're right, because when you're looking to switch jobs, especially if you're looking to switch industries, it is kind of a new social world that you're trying to enter into. And it's interesting. I actually talked with a job seeker last week, and I was encouraging this person to try out informational interviewing and to talk to people that she doesn't really know and try to learn more about their jobs and kind of learn more about the companies where they work. And her response to me was, I really don't think that's going to work for me. And I said, why? And she said, well, I've reached out to two people. I think one was maybe a family member. The other was a close friend. And she said, they didn't help me at all. I don't know why a stranger would help me. Because this obviously doesn't work, like reaching out to people. And I think it just kind of plays back to your point about the redundancy. And sometimes too, like someone that you feel like owes you help, maybe they don't have a lot to offer, or maybe they're busy and they can't offer that right now.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you tell that specific story, because I hear the same thing from so many people. They feel so stuck. And the real question is, first of all, is it worth doing this? Secondly, how do they do it? And there's also a tremendous feeling of helplessness about it, which is, this is going to be, first of all, socially painful for me because, it's comfortable, it's nice, it feels good to talk to people who are in the same wavelength, who we know will support us, but actually to first of all recognize the value that these new people are bringing, and then get that social courage to actually talk to them. That's a big leap, because we feel so stuck, especially at these really difficult times when you need a new opportunity, or you feel threatened in terms of your job or your position.
Mm-hmm. Well, so say that we have gotten up the courage and we're willing to maybe give this a try. I mean, in your perspective, like how can we go about expanding our social circle? Where should we begin?
So I think we should not begin with people who we don't know at all. So I think it's really hard to simply start from a cold call, unless you can see and articulate a real true connection between yourself and that other person. And so, for example, when you emailed me, there was a lot of connection in terms of the work that we were doing, and that where there was a possibility for collaboration. And for the person you were coaching, I think what is interesting, especially when we talk about networking, is not to really think about you asking them for stuff. And I think asking for advice is a great way to start, because people like to give advice and feel elevated to the place of expert. But also to think about where that individual could offer some collaboration. And I think it's very important a lot of my MBA students and executives as well who I work with, they often are very interested in networking upward. So they're saying, how do I connect with people who are senior leaders in my company? And it's very hard for them, because when you're networking from a position of inequality like that, it never works really well, because you feel like you're asking for stuff, you feel like you're wasting their time, you feel like you're asking for a job, and this whole dynamic of me owing you for providing me with this wisdom or this opportunity, that transactional element is really hard. So the best advice I can give my students and business people in those kinds of difficult situations is, can you really articulate a value proposition of collaboration? And so my students may be really junior, but you know what? They may have some extremely cutting edge knowledge about, for example, as you're saying, digital marketing, that some of the senior executives might happen to need at that point. And if they can say, here's my experience with social media, with my online presence, here's how I can connect with you, that person will want to talk to them. And that job and that whole relationship emerges much more organically than a very stilted conversation, which is, give me an opportunity there.
Mm-hmm. I think you're right. You mentioned finding things in common, so that the person has more of a reason to connect with you and to give you a chance. One thing I really love to do is on LinkedIn, you can actually, your university typically will have a page on LinkedIn. You can, in the search bar, you can kind of search for your university name. And when you go to the university page, there is usually a blue button on that page that says See Alumni. And when you click it, it takes you to a screen where you can actually filter by city and by company and by job function. So I love to see people who, if they are reaching out to a stranger, maybe you try to find someone that went to your university that works at this organization where you're interested to work. Because if you send them an email and just say, hey, I'd love to learn about your job or what you do, I mean, there's not a lot of reason for them to say yes. But if you write them and say, hey, I noticed that we both went to Pepperdine, and by the way, I love your job and would love to talk to you. I think the probability of the person saying yes goes up considerably if you can find that connection.
That simple idea of having something in common with someone, it's a completely different interaction at that point, right? It's not a cold call. It's, we are actually traveling in the same universe in some sense. Here's how we go together, or how we connect together. And it's a basic psychological principle of similarity. We like people who are like us. And so if I meet you and we are even the same height, that simple thing, I feel comfortable around you, talking to you, or the fact that you like to run and so do I. That simple connection that we have based on that interest is immediately something that we have there in common. And I love your example of using alumni networks, because colleges, they often have these in place, but students use them, for example, only when they're looking for a job, maybe, but not in more general ways. One example that I always tell my students is they go overseas a lot for exchange programs. And one of the best things they can do is actually, if you're in, for example, Beijing, you can, many of the students, what they'll end up doing when they go abroad is they hang out with other Americans when they're abroad. So they find people of the same nationality and they connect with those people. You can be in China, you can be in Japan, but you're still hanging out with other Americans. As a simple thing you can do is find your alumni organization over there, and all of a sudden you're going to have the best experiences of your time in China, because you'll meet real business people, you'll meet real people who are in China, you'll be exposed to their social networks, and it's a totally different international experience, for example, once you have that ticket into that world. The funny thing, though, about commonality, and I want to say there's a dark side of it as well. And so in psychology, we talk about the common information effect. And it's a really interesting conversational habit that happens. And so suppose the two of us meet and you have all of these interesting experiences in digital marketing, and I have all these experiences as a psychologist or a academic. So the two of us meet at a party, and we both discover we have the same breed of dog. So we found our commonality at that point. And the really pernicious thing that happens according to the common information effect is we now spend the whole party sitting there talking about the same breed of dog that we have. Isn't he cute? Isn't that great? And so we end up squandering the diversity. We find that commonality, and we hang on to that for dear life in our conversation, and we lose the chance to learn from each other, to learn what we have that is different. So commonality is great, but it also causes us to squander the diversity that's there.
That's so interesting. I think you're right. I know there are certain people who who I'm friends with. And when I see them, they ask me every single time. I'm sure I do the same thing in return. They ask me the same questions. Like, how are your cats? Like, whatever the thing is, that, like, if they have cats, they want to know about my cats. Like, there's always something in common, and they just focus down on that. It's like we're having this repeat conversation each time, just different like status updates on the same thing.
Same thing, right? And so I think this is interesting, which is sometimes you don't need to wander outside your social world to find diversity. You can have different interactions with the same people. And I have had one of my favorite stories on this is my husband and one of his friends was they knew each other from college. They'd gone to business school together, and so they have had the same business school type of conversations where they talk about job stuff, they talk about business school buddies, they talk about their same kind of interactions from college. So they have had that same conversation. And I was, I had just gotten married to my husband, and so the wives all got together. And as you know, the wives sometimes just start talking to each other. The men start talking to each other about their stuff. And so what was happening was, as women, we were kind of getting into kind of the full relationship. And I was sharing that my husband had lived in Africa and had a lot of connections over there. And after a while, I noticed the husband started listening to our conversation because they were learning things that they hadn't known, and they'd known each other for decades, and they hadn't talked. And the friend turned to my husband and said, "I didn't know you had any Africa connection." And my husband's like, "Yeah, that's my favorite." They had never talked about that, even though they'd known each other all that time. And it's interesting, I think, that we do this all the time. We get into conversational ruts with the same individuals. It's not just that we're in the same social networks. We're in a rut with the same individual in that network as well.
That's really interesting. And it's also interesting you mentioned how, like, at a party, men may talk together and the women may talk together. It makes me think of, I'm actually in a car club. I started my career in the automotive industry. And anyway, the car club sometimes has like events and parties, and most people, bring their spouse. And as you can imagine, most of the club members are all men. Almost all of them, I think, are men. But when we have these parties, they bring their wives. And especially when I first joined, I would sort of just be pushed over into the section with the women who were not interested in cars. Like, that's not why they came to the meeting or to the event. And I found that really interesting, that just because, I looked like, I'm a different gender, that I was not someone that they were as interested to talk to about cars. But it was an interesting experience. It kind of made me think of it as you were sharing that.
And I think what's so important is it's so habitual, it's so natural that kind of gender segregation occurs. And my favorite example of this is it starts so early, and it starts with elementary school kids. When you look at their patterns of gender segregation, right? There's the boys and the girls. And there's one of the most famous network diagrams that, the pictures of networks you'll see is of a third grade classroom. And basically there are two networks. It's bimodal. There are boys and there's girls. And there's one little connector person, which is one boy who thinks he has a friend who's a girl. And the girl doesn't even reciprocate the tie. She doesn't say he's his friend. And so it's just that segregated from so early on. And I see this, for example, with my daughter. And so my daughter presented me with her list of invitees for her birthday party. And of course, this is, all girls on that list. And I said, that list is not acceptable to me. And I actually forced her to invite half boys, half girls. And what ended up happening, and it was interesting because she loves sports. And so her party was at a jump zone. And so all the boys said yes. Some of the girls couldn't come, but all the boys said yes because boys like jumping, and that was 100%. And as she went through the list, what she ended up saying was, she's like, actually, I like this boy. We've discussed play dates, but habitually, automatically, she gravitated to the girl group because that's the natural way girls divide themselves. And when they were actually put together, they integrated naturally because they had a common activity which situated them physically together. And so they were interacting in a non-gender based way because there was an activity there that I think they could all interact with as equals. And I think that's really important to find and create activities that bring people together, that where they can. And so sports is a great way that happens, I think, naturally.
No, I think you're right. And, I want to go back for just a second. You mentioned going to another country and hanging out with people that are just like you in the other country. And you mentioned activities and finding common activities. And the thing that always comes up for me, I've done quite a bit of like solo travel. And when I go to other countries, I'm thinking, how can I meet people who are not just tourists? Like, how can I meet people who really live here and learn a little bit more about this local culture, not just the touristy stuff, but like the real people stuff. And I started years ago doing sort of, I guess, weird things. Like, for example, I was in Stockholm, Sweden a few years back, and I took salsa dancing lessons. And people sometimes ask me, like, why would you do that? But the thing is, there are no tourists taking salsa dancing lessons in Sweden. So when I wanted to make local connections and learn more about the local culture, it was like the perfect way to meet new people. And in a dance class, you kind of get rotated around between all these different partners. And so you get a chance to talk to a lot of different people too. So it's just kind of an interesting thing to think about, like, how can I create a situation that's a little different?
Yeah, and I think we have to challenge ourselves to do that. And in the workplace, we have to also look for these kinds of places where lots of different unique people are coming together, that they're congregating together. And so a lot of things that you're talking about is how do we find these? And I love talking to people about this particular question. I always ask them that question. I talk about this in the TED Talk, and I ask my students, I said, what is the single thing that you do that causes you to bring unique and different people together? Because that's the way. It's not just about getting a job. It's about really living a richer life, which is helping you get out of your rut. And so in the workplace, there are lots of spaces that are like this, where lots of people are coming in and out, different people. In the TED Talk, I give the example of the mail room. There's these coffee rooms. Those are classic examples of places where this happens. But there's also, I think, even when you look at the schoolyard, you can see how very quickly these things can become quite segregated if we're not careful. So the playground, that ends up at the lunchroom, all of those end up being places where they should create that kind of space, but certain dynamics, maybe how they are managed, undermanaged, prevent that from happening. So you talked about, for example, how in dance classes, there's a simple dynamic where people are forced to interact with all kinds of different people. This is wonderful, right? It's not what we have to do, this rapid connections. That's not what we choose our connections, for example, in a lunchroom. What Sandy Pentland and his colleagues have suggested is a simple tweak in the lunchrooms actually changes this kind of a dynamic. So he says, just make a longer table. We have longer tables. What ends up happening is strangers are forced to sit at those longer tables than just a 2-person table or a 4-person table where I can just take the people who are in the office right next to me, and we go out to lunch every single day. The same 4 people sit together. With the longer table, lots of different people are coming there. And then we are forced to have an accidental connection with them, a conversation. That's where the structure allows some diverse connections to happen. And we can get past that social awkwardness, the habits that make us just stay with our same 3 friends, or people who look like us, or people who we feel comfortable with.
That's so interesting. And that's interesting that just a longer table can do that. I mean, I can picture it, but I don't think you normally think of it. I mean, one of the things that you talk about is filtering. Is this what you mean when you talk about filtering in terms of looking for commonalities, or what is meant by filtering?
What I meant by filtering, I wanted to use an analogy that we use so often with the internet, because we have when we search for information. So with the internet, I find it really interesting. I think it's a paradox, right? We should theoretically be connected with the whole wide world with the internet, but what we've gotten so good at doing is finding those very, very narrow subset of people who think exactly the same way that we do, who are in our tiny little communities of people who are exactly like us. We're really good at filtering and finding people with exactly our preferences. And while you can do this on the internet, we're doing this actually every single day when we are searching for people. And those filters that I'm talking about are instantaneous decisions that we're making in terms of, is this person interesting? Is this person useful? Is this person smart? Is this person relevant? All of those things. And it's a tremendously mind-closing way to interact with other people. And I see it happen all the time, especially with job searchers, where people decide, oh, this set of people isn't going to be relevant to me in my job search because it's not exactly what I'm doing. And what we're doing is we're narrowing in such a way that we're closing off the possibility of random luck, of an interesting new opportunity, of something that we couldn't predict. We think we can predict who's useful, but the way that we expose ourselves to something new, different, creative, novel, unique, lucky, is by being open to something, by widening our filter in this way.
That's really interesting. I actually think it also applies in the reverse in terms of the job search. I've really seen it a lot, especially within, tech companies that are searching for talent, and they're having a hard time finding talent because it's like they're looking for this like unicorn person who has these exact, 20 skills. And I've seen people go through interviews and maybe they meet 18 of the 20 requirements, and the company says, gosh, we really wanted you to know about this one random thing. And so we're not willing to even like talk to you further. And it can be someone who's super talented, super ambitious, and yet the company is like totally closed-minded, and yet they can't figure out why they can't seem to fill these open positions that are remaining open for like longer than 90 days.
You're
So
basically giving a perfect description of what happens in academic departments. It is, we got to find this particular kind of faculty member who does this type of research. And then everybody says, well, they're not doing exactly this type of, and before you know it, we have positions that just go unfilled for years because people are pigeonholing other people. We're determining other people can't do certain things. And I think in some sense, all of this data-based hiring has created this because we think that we can engineer it by looking at these characteristics predict a good worker. And sometimes it's somebody who's smart, who's open to learning, who's social. They may not have that checklist, but if we opened our minds in this way, we, exactly as you're saying, we would be much better at matching, finding people and connecting with them.
I agree. And it's like
dating too, by the way.
Get some. What was that?
Dating as well. The same thing applies. The checklist.
thinking that, yeah, it's almost like online dating. People are getting so used to going through and checking like the boxes on sites like Match.com.
You have to be six
And
foot one. You have to have this. You have to have this education. You have to. It's just incredible how good we've gotten at filtering, and we're still unhappy with what we end up with as a
Mhm.
result.
I mean, whether it's dating or whether it's job searching, the job candidate can meet all the 20 requirements, but maybe they're not especially motivated. They don't have a good attitude. Like, it's way more important to me to hire someone that has a great attitude, that's really committed, has a lot of grit. Like, all these kinds of things are so much more important to me than like, has this person been exposed to this particular software, or something that's kind of obscure? Have they marketed in this particular industry before? Or I don't know.
I
I think from a candidate side, it's very frustrating.
I think the whole thing is that networks and people and all, it's overwhelming. We're so overloaded, and we've got all these technologies that allow us to be selective, whether it's dating or whether it's finding. There's so many candidates, there's so many options that we have, and people say, look, I need analytic tools that are going to help me pick and choose and filter and narrow. And what my talk was really about, when I was thinking, it was really getting back to the human side of what a network is, and what the best networkers can do. And this is what I always say: the best networkers are people who can communicate what skills that they have, right? To say, how can I be useful to you, Angela? And they can also look at other people and say, how can they be useful to me? And so they're able, and I know that word useful is loaded. It makes people feel icky, like I'm using another person, or I'm just simply interacting with them because there's some use or value for me. And that's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying instead is, how do we understand how two people can connect together, can add value to each other, can make each other better? And so that's what the best networkers can do. And I love conversations I have with people. And after I have a conversation like that, whether it's a business conversation, a conversation with a student, where there is that kind of exchange, where we together have created a new possibility, a new business, a new idea that we could work. It's just one of the best feelings. It's a very creative process. And I think that's what we have to strive to in terms of interacting with others and building these connections.
I think you're totally right. And you're right. It's about getting back to the human side of things. I think it's also not being lazy. Using technology to check those boxes at some point gets a little bit lazy.
And
Well,
one of the basic ideas of networking, that there's two of them, and Erminia Barra, a lot of psychologists have also pointed this out. What they say is, we like people who are similar. We love our twins. We are narcissists, and we're also lazy. We're lazy narcissists. And so if we look at our networks, it's not just people who are like us, it's people who are just right next to us. We become friends with the person whose office is right next to ours, or whose desk or cubicle is right next to ours. It's just convenient, right? And so there's that laziness or convenience that ends up leaving us with our networks. And so rather than being more intentional and careful and trying to design something that is the network that we want to leave with, that's kind of where I guess I want people to start thinking. So the example I give is my MBA students who end up leaving the university. They want an international diverse network. They end up leaving their universities with a few people who look like them, or people who are assigned to their same core team. So they're kind of, it's a little bit lazy. That's the group that they're connected with over and over again. I often ask them, think ahead 2 years when you're graduating. What does that network look like? What would you like? And many of them say, well, I would love to have, connections with these international students, with students who, some of them who are women, some athletes, some people who are in consulting, some people in banking, some people who are in these industries. And I said, well, then really think about crafting that kind of network, rather than relying on your habits or some kind of intuitive process that's unmanaged for it to happen. Because if you don't manage it, what ends up happening is you leave the university with 3 people who look like you and who were maybe assigned to your core group.
Hmm. I totally agree. And similarly, I get a lot of questions from people who are thinking of going back to get a master's degree. And they say to me, Angela, there's good news because I found an online program and it's going to be wonderful. I can do it on the weekend and it will be super easy. It will be on my own schedule and I'll totally get the degree. And especially if it's like an MBA, I really push the person to consider looking for an in person program because as much as something online is convenient, to me at least, the value that I got from my MBA came from the people that I met, not necessarily from the courses that I took. I mean, the courses were good, but it's that personal professional network that you develop in person.
And I completely agree with that. And so part of the thing that I think universities provide is just such a wonderful network of people that are different, that are from all over the world, and they're right there. It's easy, it's convenient for you to have amazing, rich interactions. And the thing that I tell my students when they graduate is you feel great right now when you're graduating, but a few months from now, one of the things that's hardest for you is that whole network is going to be pulled away from you. And there's a real withdrawal from that. And my students, especially when they're leaving university, those first few months, it's really hard. That easy supply of social interaction, of potential dates, all of it is gone. And what they have to do once they leave that is actually be much more intentional about finding ways to interact with people that can reproduce some of that rich conversation, those opportunities. It's really hard for people because it's been just presented there easy for them.
I agree. I agree. It is definitely hard. Well, so speaking of universities, there's a study that you reference sometimes, which is a Harvard study. And it says that, at Harvard, the students are paired up in a really random way. Potentially with people they might not have a lot in common with. But, it seems like after they end up living together, they find out, that they do have some things in common. I mean, if we are interacting, I guess, with people who do seem really different than us, how do we find those commonalities?
Yeah, so this was a study that I wrote with my co-authors, Arjun Chakravarty and Chris Winship. And so the way Harvard assigns roommates is they put people of different races together. And so there's a lot of diversity in those roommate groups. And there is always conversation in the university. Well, there's certain clusters of particular minority groups or athletes that are congregating together, and they live together in the second year when they can choose alone. But when we actually studied it, what we found was that when people were assigned to each other in a lot of the group structures, they were actually staying together. And there were not so many extreme differences between, for example, same race roommates, two white students who are put together, and two different race students. And so it wasn't as extreme as what some people would think. There were, in fact, sometimes no significant differences. And for certain pairs, minority students were actually more likely to stay with the white students than white students were to stay with each other for certain minority groups. And so it is really interesting when we thought about it, because what it meant to us is that even though these people might not find each other, it's not easy to find people who are different. Once you put them together, they're able to connect at a deeper, maybe more human level than, I'm not going to approach someone who's different from me, but now that we're together, actually we discover we're both neat. We both are really interested in philosophy, and we like to exercise in the morning. And guess what? Those simple characteristics or routines, that becomes the basis of a friendship. We're accidentally put together, and now we are forced to stay together, to connect with each other. And so I think it's hard to find people who are different, but it's much easier once we're together to continue on.
Hmm. I think you're right. It makes me think of in 2011, I went through a leadership program. And at the beginning of the program, we did like a ropes course where you have to like jump off of a telephone pole and like really crazy things. And on the last day, we exchanged feedback with the other people on our team that we were pre assigned to. and we kind of went around a circle and each person gave you feedback. And when we were going around for me, I remember it got around to a man who was a different race than me. And he said to me, his feedback was, wow, I feel like I have so much in common with you. This weekend has really opened my eyes because I never would have thought I would have so much in common with a woman of your race. And it was interesting. Like, it was really interesting feedback because, yeah, we did have a lot in common. I think I'm so used to being different than everyone else that most of the people I'm friends with are different than me. But it was an interesting discovery at the end of that process.
One of the things that I always advise when you're organizing meetings or social events is to randomly pair people together so they can make these discoveries on their own. And it kind of goes back to your point about the salsa classes, which is we need to be, as managers, we need to put people and kind of create structures where they can overcome, human beings can overcome their natural habits. So if we have organizations that randomly pair us together, for example, then we can have a head start. We can start the process of building difference, building relationships across difference. So, for example, at meetings, if you let people sit where they want, all the friends sit together, they always agree with each other, and you get very coalitional patterns or dynamics that end up occurring. I let my students sit together wherever they want in the classroom when they first come in, and it's amazing how that creates. You see the network that already exists in the classroom, in the cohort. All the people who are of particular race, you see sitting in particular areas, or not all, but you know what I'm saying. There's a lot of self grouping in this particular way, and what we do throughout the classroom is forcing people to connect with people, randomly pairing them, forcing them to have relationships with other people, and they love it. It's awkward, but by forcing them, by me being a planner, a manager that sets those interactions up, they love it. They're like, I never knew that person and I had this much in common. Boy, I hated negotiating with this person, but it was really, really interesting. I would never have had that experience. So it's so much fun to cause people to have these interactions, and it causes them to learn and really explore where they wouldn't otherwise do it.
Absolutely. It makes sense. Well, also, I wanted to ask you, you've shared in the past about a painful experience that happened to you where I know you went through a lot of change really quickly, and rapid change is really hard. I think your job changed, you had a child, like a lot of things happened really fast. And it sounds like, I mean, I think when we're going through that kind of change and we're struggling internally, that seems like a really difficult time to want to reach out to people and to network. But it seems like it may also be a really important time. And I'm curious from your perspective, kind of like, I guess, why is it hard? And also, why is it important?
Yeah, I think if we look across our life cycle, we go through periods of opening and closing in terms of the network. And so, for example, in university, people are often in a state of openness where there's a lot of social activity. It's easy, it's fun, we're young, open-minded, all of those kinds of things. And then, you'll see maybe in a first job, maybe it goes down a little bit, but you're still in that exploring. Maybe I'm going to date a little bit, all of that. Once you get married, maybe you narrow off a little bit. Once you have a child, sometimes your friends become very, very narrow. You're only connecting with other people who have kids. It's a very common experience. And people feel really stuck at these different points in their lives. And so I think it's one part of it is, as you look through the life cycle, there are different ways our network is also moving as well. Particularly hard, I think, are these traumatic times. My co-authors, Ned Smith and Lee Thompson, and we wrote a paper about this. And what we discovered was that when people feel threatened what happens is, and what I mean by threatened is you're nervous about a job loss, or you're just feeling out of control, not very confident, all of those very negative feelings. It's not very surprising. I think people tend a lot of times to reach inwards, and it's particularly the case with those who are lower socioeconomic status. And what this means is people who it's threat plus it's a double hit, right? Because they may be from a lower socioeconomic group. There's maybe a double sense of being down and out. And so this set of individuals may be much more likely to reach inwards. People who are of higher socioeconomic status, people who are maybe have a naturally innate sense of confidence, saying, you know what, I'm gonna get out of my comfort zone. I need a job. I need to bounce back here. They are much more fearless about reaching outside of their comfort zone, saying, I'm going to risk that social rejection and find people who are outside that comfort zone. I can get maybe a new opportunity. If some of them reject me, I guess I'm going to have to keep trying. You use the word grit. Maybe it's like a social grit versus for others, it's a feeling of social choking. I'm stuck. I don't. And so one of the things that I think is really important about the paper that we wrote is that we can't choke in this way. It's really important at this time to figure out a way to bounce back, to be aware of this natural tendency to reach inwards and be very, very conscious about exploring so that we can bounce back.
I think you're right. I think it's really important. We're so afraid to reach out to strangers. I always try to, set expectations that if you reach out to 10 people, maybe one of them will say yes. I mean, especially if they're strangers. And maybe it'll be much higher than that. But I think if you can keep your expectations low and you focus on the one yes and not the 9 no's, you'll go much farther. You've just got to keep moving and not focus on the negativity.
Yeah, and I love that word, keep moving, because I think when we talk about learned helplessness in psychology or depression, it's like you just want to, you stop, you get stuck, you're in that rut. And the way out of it is just keep action, keep doing things, giving yourself some of these small goals. And I think we can't personalize rejection too much. Maybe if 10 people, I go on 10 dates and they reject me, maybe there is something about me that's the issue. But I think we can't personalize it, especially with job search. People, as you said, are looking, there's very narrow issues, there's fit issues, there's all kinds of things that have nothing to do with us. And we don't know the why behind it. It's really a black box. And so we just have to kind of keep continuously trying and without fear,
Yes.
without stopping.
Well,
and I think that's all we can do. And it's what is, I think, interesting for me, having given this talk, was a lot of people did send me emails and reach out because they were feeling stuck, and they did ask directly for this kind of thing. How do I get unstuck? And my heart goes out to people who are in that situation. And so I think we have to be aware of this in ourselves so that we can break out of it.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Well, Tanya, I could ask you questions all day. This is like my favorite topic, but thank you very much for joining me. If someone is wanting to learn more about your work, well, first of all, they should Google you and check out your TED Talk. But aside from that, where can we go to learn more about your work?
Well, I think the book that Lee Thompson and I wrote, which is called Stop Spending, Start Managing, is one place to start. And a lot of the ideas from the TED Talk, we have written about it in that book, and among other ideas as well. So I think that book is a good place to start. Not to sell the book or anything. I'm sure you can buy it used. I don't care, but it's a place where I think some of these ideas may be available.
No, absolutely. It sounds wonderful. Well, Tanya, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great.
Thank you so much, Angela. I appreciate it.
And thanks everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed the episode today, please don't forget to help me out. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. The more people who subscribe, the easier it is for job seekers to find the show.
Thank you for listening to the Copeland Coaching Podcast today with your host, Angela Copeland. Tune in next time to get more great tips on turning your job search into a slam dunk.